This podcast is part of the C-Suite Radio Network, turning the volume up on business.
Welcome to the Business Power Hour, hosted by Deb Creer. Join us as Deb talks with her guests, experts in their fields, as they share real-life stories and techniques to power up your business.
Good morning, good morning. I am Deb Creer, and I am passionate about giving professionals the tools that they need to make themselves and their businesses as successful as possible. And today, we're going to have such a great conversation with someone who has been on the program before, and he has pivoted. I love that word. That's one of the new in words, right, for people. He has pivoted into not a different career because he's been there before, but I don't know. It's very confusing. But we are going to be talking about something very different with this guest. So please join me in welcoming Dan Boles back to our program again. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, let me tell people a little bit about you before we jump into this. So Dan Boles is an entrepreneur and financial planner with a teacher's heart. He's passionate about educating and serving others to help them create wealth and financial independence. His professional background includes 10 and a half years of ministry work, 8.5 of which were served as the executive director of the nonprofit ministry to the university campus, and nearly 10 years of banking, financial services, and insurance. He started multiple businesses, failed a startup, run for public office, and didn't win. But he'll be the first to tell you that education and knowledge he gained gives him a tremendous advantage as a common sense financial planner. A big believer in beginning with the end in mind and teaching others the concepts and strategies that enable smart financial choices, Dan excels in taking complex issues and reducing them to understandable, problem-solving ideas. So again, Dan, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me back. It's great.
Great. Well, as I said, when we were on before, we talked totally different. And now we're going to be talking about, financial planning and some things like that. And really not as a business, but as a person, and let's be honest, we all are, we all think that we are our business, but no, we have to take care of ourselves and our own financial futures first, and those of our family and the people that we care about. And so many times I think that we forget about that, especially when we're so busy building a business, running a business, doing all of those various things. And so we might have our financial house in order with our business, but personally it's just a disaster, and there's so many things that I think that we tend to forget that's why we really wanted to have you on the program today.
Well, it's great to be here. And I agree with all that completely. And I also agree that when it comes to our personal finances and the plans and executing that plan, the hardest thing for most people to do, I have found, has always been removing the emotion from the decision-making and removing the emotion from the whole process. The good news there is it's easy to do it if you just have the right people involved in helping you do it. The bad news is, we're wired in such a way that we are emotional creatures naturally. We are passionate creatures naturally. And there's just certain things that we want to hang on to. There's just certain things that are somewhat systematic because generation after generation after generation, our families have done things certain ways, or, laws change and we're not aware of the law changes. There's so many different things that go into it. And sometimes, doggone it, no matter what you tell me, I want a red sports car, right? And it may not be a rational decision.
I can't really afford that.
It may not be a practical decision. It may not be a smart decision. Then again, maybe it is. But every person's situation is unique. And so part of what I love doing is helping my clients remove the emotion from that and reminding them, listen, all that we're doing is math.
Right.
And at the end of the day, this is just math. 1 plus 1 will always equal 2. No matter what we do, no matter what variables we throw into the puzzle, 1 plus 1 will always equal 2. And so I approach financial planning, retirement planning, all of that. I approach it the exact same way, and I just help my clients remove the emotion from the conversation and realize, look, your house, your family, your plan, and how we execute it is just like running a business. Now, there's different laws, obviously. There's different tax advantages or tax benefits and this and that between business and personal. But it's just like running a business. You need to run your finances just like a business. So a business tells its money where to go.
Right.
Why don't you? A business creates a budget and it literally tells its money where it's going to go. So should we, you know, and it's just math. It's just math.
Well, and you know, they say that money is, of course, one of the hardest things to discuss, one of the hardest things to think about, you know, and it really doesn't matter what age you are, you know, even though many of the things you should be planning for much earlier than we do, because things happen. You know, we're going to talk a little bit about wills and some things like that. And, you know, certainly as a 20-year-old, a 30-year-old, even a 50-year-old, you don't want to think, I have to have a will. You know, that's something for those people who are in their 90s. Well, sadly, things happen, you know, and we need to make sure that things are taken care of the way we want them to be taken care of. And, you know, in many cases, it's a pretty simple process. But, you know, and financial planning, you know, investing, all of these various things. And I think especially with small business owners who are pouring all of their money back into the business, you know, it is very tricky, you know, because they're not part of a corporation that has a 401k plan, you know, and things like that. And so they're thinking, you know, how do I invest, or I can't invest? And of course, there are ways to do that. But let's kind of take a little detour at the moment.
Okay.
How is it that you got into doing this? Because, you know, as I mentioned, you know, you kind of gone, maybe it's full circle, you know, and we were chatting before the program started that you have done a lot in your life, and you are just a youngster. You know, and
I don't feel young.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, there are days where it's like, oh man, but you know, you've obviously everything that you have done has made you who you are today. But it really has been kind of a diverse path. So how is it that you've come back to where this is your passion now?
Well, it's always been a passion. But I stepped out of the industry a few years ago, really because I was a little disenchanted and frustrated. And I don't know that that's a unique story. I think I have a lot of peers that feel the same way. But end of the day, I would just say that I kind of hold a conviction, a belief that the financial planning industry, the investment industry, whatever you want to call it, this industry that has everything to do with financial services and helping people with their personal financial plan. You know, it's called 50 different things, but it's all the same. It's just, it's really increasing your value year over year, right? Your net worth and your wealth and everything related to it. The industry as a whole, as long as I've been a working adult and longer, has been broken. And that kind of came to head for me a few years ago when I was still with another company. And I decided to look for greener pastures and not to toot my horn too much, but my wife and I were in a very good position financially. So I was able to take some risks. I was presented with an opportunity to be part of a startup. And I jumped on it. You know, one of my dreams is to be Mark Cuban when I'm older. So I thought, you know what, this is my chance. I'm going to take this opportunity, jump in on this startup, cross my fingers, pray, and hope to God that it works. 9 months in, it went belly up.
Oops.
And it was a very expensive kaboom. But, you know, I learned more in the process of that than probably anything else I've done, the exception maybe of running for office at the local level. So I jokingly tell people all the time, you know, I have an MBA. It's just not a traditional MBA. It was a very expensive MBA. It's just not a traditional one, right? And from there, I actually jumped into, when I was on the show last time, I was partner and co-owner of a marketing agency called Market Pros, which is still around, still doing great. And Don Storma, who is the owner and founder of that, is doing great. Highly recommend anybody that's looking for that to look him up and go that route. But ultimately, I decided that wasn't what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. It just, something was missing. And so, you know, kind of to your point a minute ago, it has been a full circle thing. And when I was 18, 19, 20, I was already working in insurance and then moved over to banking. I was with a small little bank that grew up in Atlanta called Nations Bank, and then became part of Bank America, and they merged and became Bank of America, which is probably the largest bank in the country today. And a great career there. It was a little over 3 years before my position was eliminated. And just kind of moved on down the road, got my degree, ended up at ING where we both worked
Mm-hmm.
for a little while. We know a lot of the same people, which is awesome, and love it there. But a lot of the philosophies that I have when it comes to financial planning, even back then, late 90s, early 2000s, when I would share those ideas, those concepts, those strategies, that philosophy of mine with people, I'd get laughed out of a lot of rooms because I was told it was not possible, or that's not how this works, or you need to do it our way because this is the way we've always done it, or whatever. So it's really just kind of, I was really disenchanted a few years ago when I stepped out. I actually left ING right after my first child was born. I was a stay-at-home dad for a couple of years with him, which was a blast.
Oh, great. Yeah.
But as a guy, like you kind of have to have something to do.
Mm-hmm.
And not to knock stay-at-home parents. They're my heroes all day long.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't matter if you're a mom or a dad, if you're a stay-at-home parent.
Mm-hmm.
There's nobody on this planet that I have more respect for than them.
Mm-hmm.
That is the most underappreciated, undervalued, and underpaid job on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
But, it's just kind of one of those things where I needed something to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I stumbled into part-time youth ministry, did that for a little while, and then ended up in university ministry and ended up executive director of a nonprofit for 8.5 years.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
That was an incredible learning experience because I went from starting a ministry completely from scratch that was kind of a whim, kind of an idea that a bunch of people had, and they recruited me to run the show basically. And I just remember thinking, oh my God, I've done youth ministry for 3 years. I don't know what I'm doing. And these guys are thrusting me into leadership as an executive director. What in the world? And but I mean, it was a ride, and then I came back into the industry, and then was in it until 2016 when I stepped out. But Capstone, which is who I'm with now, Capstone Financial, it's been in Atlanta since 1886. They're a premier wealth advisory firm. They're well known throughout Atlanta, and they're now moving into Florida, Tennessee, and the Carolinas.
Mm-hmm.
They came to me towards the end of last year and said, Dan, we'd really like you to come work with us.
Mm-hmm.
And I just kind of kept pushing back.
No.
I'm over it. I'm done. I'm out.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, they were persistent and they kept on. And I finally just said, well, what is it about me that you want me to be part of the team for? Why do you want me?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, they understood where I was coming from with me kind of being disenchanted and having left. And I'd been out 2.5 years at that point, almost 3. And so, I've got to relearn everything. I got to renew my licenses. I got to do all this stuff to come back. So I need you to help me, A, understand why you want me, and B,
why would you want to? Mm-hmm.
Why do I want to? Exactly. And what hooked me instantly was I knew that we were in alignment, and I knew that their philosophy mirrored mine when they said, Dan, the industry's broken.
Mm-hmm.
We need guys like you that understand it's broken. We need guys like you that are character guys, that are integrity guys, that want to do it the right way, that want to turn everything upside down and begin with the end in mind and fix this industry because it's important to the financial well-being of our clients and this country. And I just remember sitting there in that meeting and thinking, this isn't possible. It's too good to be true. And, but the deeper I dove with them, the more I got a chance to sort of look behind the curtain and see what their operation looked like and talk to people on the team. I got to know the GA, got to know the managing director, and I know a couple people that work there. They were working on me too. That's how I got introduced. But, the more I got to see, the more I began to realize, hey, this is legit. This is a great company. And they made me an offer and said, we want you bad enough that we want to give you the chance to be a VP in 3 to 5 years and have your own go out and do your thing if you want. So it's a tremendous opportunity for me. But at the same time, I know they're leveraging my expertise and my connections and my skill set to do great things for our clients. And that's one of the other things I love too is, my approach has always been, I think financial planning should be a boardroom conversation. If that's how businesses do it, right? They have their entire C-suite at the table making these important decisions. Why don't we? Right? So every family should have a CEO, a CFO, a COO, right? And so I want to be that family CFO for my clients. I want them to know and trust that they can call me or email me or text me, however they like to communicate. They can get a hold of me very easily. I'm very accessible and say, hey, we're thinking about buying a Ferrari. Do you think that's a good idea? depending on the client, I'll say that's a
Right, yeah.
wonderful idea, or that's a terrible idea.
Or maybe you need the Matchbox version.
Maybe a Camaro, maybe Corvette, maybe not a Ferrari, maybe a Camry.
Mm-hmm.
It's just sort of understanding that even as families, even as individuals, we really ought to take a boardroom approach to putting a plan in place and executing it so that we can stay on track and stay on plan, so that we can remove that emotion from the process and make smart financial decisions.
Yeah. Well, Dan, that's great. And one of the things that you mentioned was your ministry. And I think that in many ways, especially when I think about this, and you mentioned I've been in the financial world also, those two, it often seem to be counterintuitive. And so I love that you bring your faith into what you're doing, because it is something that I think people, they think it, making money is bad. Making money is evil, and it's not. It's planning for our future. And in many cases, it is that you're planning to leave a legacy with, say, your church or, some things like that. So,
things you can do there.
Yeah, and it is part of bringing everything together. You mentioned the fact that, we need the CFO, the CMO, all of those things. And when we're doing our own personal financial planning, we don't do that. We don't stop and think, even what's my current budget? What are my future plans? Can I buy that Ferrari? Can I buy that house? All of these various things. And nobody ever talks. And it is what, excuse me, money is the leading cause of divorce. People don't want to talk about it. Seems like when they do talk about it, all they do is fight about it. So I love that you can bring in kind of, and maybe it is that you've been a minister, that facilitating portion to be able to kind of talk people through what might be some difficult conversations.
They can be. And sometimes I joke and say I'm really a therapist, right? Mm-hmm. I have a teacher's heart, and I always have. Ever since I was young, I've kind of had that teacher's heart. And my faith is absolutely a big piece of who I am, big piece of my identity. And I hear it all the time, oh, you can't take anything to heaven with you, so what's the point? You might as well, enjoy it while you've got it and spend it. Mm-hmm. And I always tell people, look, you've got it backwards. A couple of things I'll say to that. One is, when you pass on, what you leave behind is your final loving act, right? Your family. Mm-hmm. And it's not a one act show. It's a constant act if you set it up right. I have a friend who had a family member that passed away, and it was actually her dad. And when he passed away, he did so in such a way, he had a plan in place that he was touching her life at least 3-4 times a year for the next 20 years.
Oh.
Flowers, cards, letters, gifts. I mean, you name it. He made sure that his daughter and everybody else in the family knew, I may not be there, but I was part of your life.
Right.
And he did a lot of charitable giving too, which was wonderful. And I like being able to help people do that. I mean, it's important to me to help people understand, look, yeah, you can't take your riches with you, but what you do with what you have in your life, biblically speaking, you are called to be a steward of what you're given, right? And when you're given a little and you're responsible with it, you're going to be given more, right? So naturally, if what we do with our resources, if we make smart decisions with it, we're going to see more. It's going to multiply. And so there needs to be a plan in place. There needs to be a legacy and estate plan in place. And I want to know with my clients, I start every conversation with any new client with, do you have a will? Do you have a trust? Do you have advanced healthcare directives? Do you have a living will? How do all those things happen? And I don't make a dime on any of that. I don't do that. I don't make it.
It's part of everything, as we were saying.
It does. And all of that shapes what I do and what my team at Capstone does when we put options together for our clients to choose from and decide which way they want to go based on their goals. And the reason I start there, the reason Capstone starts there, has everything to do with tax efficiency and minimizing that tax impact, because the reality is, I said earlier, the industry is broken. It's broken in a number of ways. One of them is structure, but another is, and we'll get to this a little bit later, but when you think about retirement planning and the conversations that you hear, the commercials that you see, the ads that you see, the conversations that a lot of my colleagues have, whether it's, in a networking setting or in a client setting or just out in public, you'll hear them talk a lot about asset accumulation, wealth accumulation, asset allocation, and those are all good things to talk about. I'm not trying to say they're not.
Right.
But what you don't hear them talk about is tax efficiency, tax planning. And I'm not a CPA, I'm not a tax expert, but I bet your bottom dollar I'm going to get your CPA involved in the conversation, because they're part of that boardroom council of advisors that are helping you put your plan together. And I need to know what their thinking is when they're doing your taxes and your tax preparation. And they need to know what my thinking is in the process. And we all need to know what you, if you're the client, what your thinking is and what your goals are and what's kind of going through your mind as far as, strategy goals and where are you today versus where you want to be tomorrow and where you've come from.
Right.
It's that boardroom approach. And it's just not something that is commonly done in this industry. The other thing I'll say to people all the time is I'll ask them to pull out their driver's license and say, show me your driver's license. And I'm like, why do you want to see my driver's license?
Yeah.
So I want to know if you're an organ donor. And a lot of people are organ donors. So it's kind of quirky and kind of cliche to say this, but at the end of the day, it's true. If you're willing to give a complete stranger that you've never met your vital organs, then shouldn't you be willing to make sure that your family has a legacy and the final act of love, a financial plan in place for when you're dead?
Right.
And a lot of people think, I've never really thought of it that way. You should. Because really, at the end of the day, it's true. If you're willing to give a complete stranger your vital organs, wouldn't you want to also make sure your family is taken care of?
Right. Well, and I think so many people just assume they will be. Well, I don't need a will because it'll automatically, and we'll talk about this in more detail. They think, well, it will, what I have automatically goes to my spouse, or all of these various things, and then there are family. We kind of have this running joke in my family that you want the last check that is written using your money to be to the undertaker, and you want it to bounce. And so you've literally spent down to the very last penny. And while there is, we definitely want, people to be enjoying their life. I mean, it's not save, and never enjoy anything, because, you got to get there. But, things happen. We mentioned that, and so you can't be planning for someday, and I think that's the part that people really don't take into account when they're doing their financial planning, is they're either not planning at all, or they're just planning so far out that they forget that there's all this time in between that they need to be enjoying life. If the Ferrari really is going to make it for them right then, okay, then maybe they need the Ferrari. But, it's the common. I know, yeah. We live in a town where there are Ferraris that go by, and I'm like, really? Oh. I'd be one of those, I'd park it 9 miles away from anything, and of course, I couldn't have that, I'd just be so scared that it was going to get dinged. But it's that combination of living and enjoying now, and then being able to live comfortably and, in your retirement, and then leave that legacy. And for some people, they might not want to leave a legacy, but there are many things people never even thought about. We've started having the discussion with the University of Colorado, which is where both my husband and I went to college, about leaving a legacy for them. We don't need to get into details on things like that, but one of the things on the plans that they set up is you can change it. You might be saying, okay, we're going to give X number of dollars now, but that can change, and so you're committing to it. And of course they like you to commit to that because then it helps for their bookkeeping purposes.
Absolutely.
But it's not written in stone. And, I think that's one of the things that people tend to mistake is they think, well, if I say I'm going to do X, it means I absolutely have to do X. No, situations change. You might want to give more. You might want to give less, all these various things.
Absolutely. And you kind of touched on a couple of things that are good segues for some of the things I wanted to cover today.
Okay. Jump in.
Wills and estates in particular.
Right.
Well, let me back up actually and talk about just having a financial plan even. Depending on who you listen to and what expert they are and when you hear it, you'll hear industry experts talk about 80 to 86%, somewhere in that range of people in this country do not have a financial advisor, do not have a financial planner, do not have a financial plan. They're just paycheck to paycheck or winging it or DIYing it. And look, if you're a DIYer, I get it. There's things that I like to do myself too. But in the day, you really need to be careful if you're DIYing your financial plan. I have to go through a ton of education and a ton of licensing and certifications to do what I do. And I'm, I'm back into this after a brief hiatus, but I'm working alongside some of the brightest minds in the industry at Capstone. And I love that. I love that if there's an area where I don't know something like I'd like to know it, I just walk down the hall and knock on the door and say, hey, so-and-so, a client, this is kind of what I'm dealing with. What do you think? And, get their advice. And that's the other thing is with Capstone, my clients don't have access to just me. It's me plus 100 other advisors and planners. And we're a very collaborative, work together, teamwork sort of firm. We're all in business by ourselves, for ourselves, but we're not really by ourselves. It's very much a partnership.
Right.
So, I've got one example is for clients that are in the healthcare industry, particularly doctors and pharmacists, practitioners of any kind in the healthcare industry that are high income earners. Capstone owns Wealth MD, which is a well-known wealth management firm for doctors and health professionals. And it's a huge asset. So the clients that I have that happen to be in that field, I can say to them, if there's something in particular that is part of your profession and I'm not really aware of, how the implications might be for your plan or your taxes or whatever, we've got resources at our disposal for no charge that we have to use. So that's a very, very important thing. But to get back to the wills and the estates thing, most people don't have a will either. People always think, oh, well, all my stuff will go to my spouse or all my stuff will go to my kids. The reality is chances are, depending on what state you live in, if you don't have a will that you have written and had notarized yourself, the state that you live in has written one for you.
Yes. And they may or may not do what you want with it.
Bad news. It's good news but it's also bad news. And the bad news is if you go read it, you're probably going to find you don't like what it says.
Right.
And I don't know about most people, but I do know in my case, number one, I don't want the state determining where my assets go, partly because I know they're going to keep half.
Right.
But I also don't want them determining where the rest of it goes because who knows where they'll decide to put it. And the second thing, and this is honestly the most important thing for me as a father, I don't want the state determining where my children go.
Right.
I don't want the state determining who's going to take care of my children. They may not choose the same people as me.
Right. And I think that's something that parents really have to have that and with themselves, they need to have that conversation because, you might think that your brother Bob is a great person and your wife's going to who? No, and it is one of those things that, and it needs to be, as you said, written down. You have to take these steps. It can't just be that you've told somebody, well, hey, if something happens to me, here's what we want to happen. I mean, I know people who have even detailed out who their pets are going to be taken care of, by, and it's funny that people go to that degree with pets, but then they don't stop to think about their kids. And you're right. The state might say, it's going to be a grandparent, somebody like that. And it's like, no, that really wasn't who you wanted. So you need to take those steps, and we all obviously like to hope that nothing's going to go wrong, and especially for people who are healthy and have married someone who's healthy, all those various things. But unfortunately, tragedies happen and accidents happen. And so you need to take those steps. I actually do have a will. Oh, yay, I have a will. And I did that when I was diagnosed with cancer. I thought, I should probably just make sure that, everything goes where I want it to go. And so, I've taken those steps and done all of that. And, and then I was very surprised to learn that my medical powers of attorney are state specific. I mean, that was very strange when I discovered that, if something happened when I was in another state, just because I had that little piece of paper that says that, my husband is the person in charge, that place doesn't have to honor it, that state, and so it's, and it gets tricky. And that's why obviously it's good to, you can do it yourself. But I mean, these are just two real small examples of why it's best to consult, an expert.
Absolutely. And I have some wonderful estate attorneys all throughout Georgia that I work with to refer clients to. Mm-hmm. There's some good online resources too. Right. One of them is, if you don't mind me sharing it sure. on the show today, mm-hmm. One of them is doyourownwill.com or doyourownwill.org. I forget the exact link, but I'll try and send that to you so that you can put it in the description. Mm-hmm. But if you're a DIYer or you're just someone that isn't ready to spend the $300 to $500 to maybe even $1,000 together an estate plan that includes all of those documents, mm-hmm. I get it, and especially someone that's young, single, no children, or
and has a pretty basic and simple, basic,
But the minute you start having children, and the minute you start acquiring any kind of assets, and a lot of people don't realize you have more assets than you realize. I mean, one of the questions I ask clients and prospective clients alike is, do you know what your greatest asset is? Mm-hmm. And the typical answers are my 401k or my house, mm-hmm. or my grandfather had a pension fund and he mm-hmm. passed away and he rolled it into a trust, and so that's there for me when I hit a certain age or whatever. End of the day, that's not your greatest asset. Mm-hmm. Your greatest asset's actually your ability to get up every day and go to work.
Right.
If you do the math, right, it's just mm-hmm. math. If you do the math and you mm-hmm. add it up, that's your greatest asset. Mm-hmm. And it's also the number one thing that most people fail to protect. Mm-hmm. Disability income policies are, I don't want to get deep into the weeds with product. I really shouldn't be discussing product.
Right. Yes. Disclaimer time.
Disclaimer time. But there are strategies. That's the better way to put this. There are strategies, there are tools and resources that everyone, no matter what their income is, mm-hmm. can put in place to protect themselves. Mm-hmm. And a good financial plan is grounded, is rooted in a foundation mm-hmm. of protection. Mm-hmm. And then from there, you look at growing. Then from there, you look mm-hmm. at, okay, how can we, what strategies can we put in place to really throw some fuel on the fire, mm-hmm. whatever you want to call it. But the reality is, I believe that it's worth it to pay those attorneys to do their job. Mm-hmm. That's why they're experts. They went mm-hmm. to school 6, 7, 8 years. Mm-hmm. And then they passed one of the toughest exams in the country in their bar exam to get that license, practice that law. Mm-hmm. And I there's some great ones mm-hmm. and I can refer people to them all day long. I'm happy to do that because mm-hmm. I don't want to really put a plan in place for a client until I know that's dealt with. Right. There's a couple other things that I want to make sure are dealt with too. One of them is I want to make sure my clients have an insurance umbrella policy mm-hmm. in place. I don't sell those anymore. I'm no longer in the property and casualty mm-hmm. business. So I don't make any money on that. Mm-hmm. But, I will make sure that my clients go back to whoever their agent is for their home and their auto insurance and have a conversation with mm-hmm. them. And I'll make sure their agent knows, hey, so-and-so should be calling mm-hmm. you to have this conversation. Mm-hmm. You need to have $1 million or $2 million umbrella policy in place to protect yourself.
Well, and especially if you're a small business owner and one that's not in an industry where insurance is required. So say a contractor, something like that. I have an umbrella policy to cover my business. And I do this for a living. So people think, well, why on earth would you need an umbrella policy? Well, you never know when something might happen. And, and for the amount of coverage, it really is very inexpensive. It, like you said, dovetails onto your homeowner's insurance in many cases, and I think that's one thing that especially small business owners and entrepreneurs don't stop to think about, and maybe it's something, that really simple, say you're doing crafts and you're selling them on Etsy. Well, what if somebody swallows a pokey pin from one of your things and sues you? I mean, for a couple $100 you could be covered.
Reality is, whether you're in business for yourself or not, and you're an employee somewhere or whatever, I tell people all the time, it's not a matter of if you get sued. It's a matter of when you get sued.
Right.
And when you look at the cost of an umbrella policy, depending on how much coverage you get, $1 million, $2 million or up, depending on your age and what you do for a living, you're talking about $150 to $300 a year. You do the math and you add that up and you begin to realize, okay, $150 to $300 a year times 20, 30, 40 years, that's going to cost me X amount of dollars.
Right.
But that protects me from $1 million, $5 million lawsuit, which means my home is protected from getting a lien against it. Wages are protected from being garnished.
Right.
Assets are protected from seizure, right? When you start to really understand the value of protection, and most successful, smart people already know it. I don't have to tell them, they already know it. But most younger people that don't have the experience yet, the life experience to understand that, they're just kind of coming into that. I work with some folks that are in their mid to late 20s, and they're just beginning to hit those earning years and develop, asset accumulation. They don't know that yet, but that's really because nobody's taught them that yet. So when I sit down with them, it's like, okay, you may not need this yet, right? You may not have any assets yet. You may not really have any exposure yet, but at some point you're gonna. The minute you get married, the minute you have a child, and those of us that do have children, our minds probably all go to the same place at the same time. One of them is going to turn 16 soon, right?
Yeah, and be driving.
And they're going to start driving. And so you better believe that, my oldest is 14. Between now and when he turns 16, I'm going to up my umbrella policy considerably because let's face it, 16-year-olds do 16-year-old things, and life happens. So all insurance is as a product really is a piece of paper that says, I promise to pay this much in exchange for this. This company promises to take on my risk exposure. That's it.
The other thing that I use, reason why I got my umbrella policy, and hopefully we'll never need it for, but the reason I have it is because I volunteer and I serve on boards, and boards can be sued. I served on a nonprofit board in Colorado. We had an employee that we terminated, and she sued us, and she sued the board, and then she sued us all individually.
Yep.
And, and it was one of those things, turned out fine. We as the nonprofit had the board of directors insurance that, that we were required to have, and all those various things. And so our own assets and everything were never touched, but we could have been in serious trouble, and we volunteer for things, whether it's your church, whether it's your kids' stuff. I mean, all these various things, you never know when you might be sued. I saw this was just on the news yesterday, where it was a group of parents who decided to dry out the baseball field. I don't know if you saw this. They were going to dry out the baseball field. There were 10 of these people that made this decision. So 10 people who thought this was wise. They poured gasoline all over this baseball field and set it on fire. And of course, it completely ruined the field. And, what if somebody had been burned? I mean, all sorts of things. So that umbrella policy really is just kind of that extra, in case you do something stupid, maybe insurance.
Well, and the other beauty, and I know this because I have a background, I think I mentioned this earlier, but I did spend some time at Allstate, did spend some time with Nationwide. And so I do have a background in property and casualty in addition to all the other stuff that I've done. The reality is, if you have the umbrella policy in place, you file a claim on that policy just goes away and you replace it. It doesn't touch your homeowner's policy or your auto policy unless it absolutely has to, right? So unless it's an incident that happens in the home or an incident that happens related to you driving your car, there's a good chance that you can just file the claim through the liability policy only. Then it never touches the liability on your home, which means your homeowner's policy is protected, and that premium's not going to, I will tell you all day long, I tell people this all the time, you would be amazed at the stories I can tell you. I love, I won't say which company it is, but there's a current property and casualty company. It's a good company, a mutual company, and they have some really funny commercials, and it's about, you wouldn't believe some of the stories that we know about.
Oh, yes, yes.
And, to that point, I mean, I've seen a lot of crazy, strange things, and
things happen.
things happen. And it's astounding to me in this seat as a 40-year-old father of 3, husband, business owner, entrepreneur that does volunteer, that's on a couple of boards, right? And it's astonishing to me to know that I have so many of my peers that, it's not that they're stupid. They just don't know.
No. Yeah. You just don't stop to think, well, wait a minute. What if?
Yeah. These are incredibly smart people. And so when I have those conversations, I'm like, well, they're like, oh, I'm not going to need that. I'm not going to need that. And I just look at them. I'm like, well, what if you're wrong?
Right. Can you afford
what's your
to be?
plan? What's your plan?
Yeah. Well, and like you said, it's $100 to $300. Now, obviously it's different if you don't have a home, all these various things, but you can still get covered.
But even if you're renting, you can get.
Yeah. That's 1 hour of legal time. Think of it that way, and so if you had to go hire a lawyer, you've spent that much, and so, just to have it covered and do all of that. And seriously, folks, if you are a small business owner, an entrepreneur, even if you've done all the right steps and incorporated, done all of those things, set your business up right, you still want to personally protect yourself by having something as simple as an umbrella policy.
Well, and I don't want to make this sound so terse, but at the end of the day, do you love your family? Do you want to make your family at ease and at peace? Or do you want to throw the dice on the table and take that gamble that, you don't have the protection in place, and then all of a sudden that lawsuit happens and you lose all your assets and now you're homeless, and now you got to look at your wife and your children, or your husband and your children, and say, oops, I'm sorry.
Right. Yeah. Or maybe there went the kid's college fund, or, whatever. Or maybe you're not around, it's been that tragic and they're having to deal with it. And so
probably made a lot of PNC agents really happy today.
I know. They're all
but, I think it's important as a financial planner. Yeah, I love it. I think it's important as a financial planner, though, that the people have these things in place. Right. You need the will, you need the power of attorney, you need the living will, you need the umbrella policy. The cost of those things is nominal compared to the cost of what could happen and what will happen if you don't have a plan. And like I said earlier, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So, I believe in hedging my bets and having a plan in place to deal with the what ifs. And, the funny thing is, your financial plan tends to get rewarded the more conservative you are with protecting yourself and planning for those risks. The more you tend to accumulate.
Right.
There is a correlation.
And because you're thinking of it. I mean, it's just kind of, you're in that mindset.
Yep.
And it is also important, I want to point out, that this is not get it and forget it. You need to be updating it. You might have done all of this when you had 1 child. Now you have 3. They might have kids now. All of these various things. When I worked for ING, it is a life insurance company, and it was one of those things where people would say, well, my beneficiary was so-and-so, who is a former spouse. And golly gee, we're divorced and I want my money, and it's like, no, you had to have redone that. It doesn't matter what you wanted or even what your will said. What that insurance policy said is who that money goes to. So, it's all these pieces, because we had people say that all the time. Well, my will says, or, they didn't say it. Their estate said, the will said this. And it's like, that life insurance policy was to benefit so-and-so.
And those policies trump the will.
Yes. Yeah. And, and that is the one thing people don't understand, is the policy trumps.
It does. And that's why it's important to sit down with your planner, your advisor, at least once a year. I recommend 2 or 4 times a year to just review that stuff, because life will life. Life is going to happen. And, I know it's hard. I know that everybody's busy. I'm busy. I got 3 kids. And But I'm going to take time out of my schedule to make sure that my plan is in place and that it's constantly being updated, because life happens, and I want to make sure the same is true for my clients. And
Well, and if you're doing it, say 3 or 4 times a year, it's probably a fairly short meeting, as opposed to every 5 years, every 10 years. Oh my gosh, you're almost starting over.
Yep. It's a quick check-in. And hey, life happens. Has anything changed since we last talked 3 months ago?
Nothing? Okay.
Have you gotten divorced? Have you gotten married? Have you had a child? Has a child died? There's all these questions, but you can just run through them really fast.
Yeah.
And then you can review positions and strategies, and are we on track, and those things too. I have a process, and I very much believe in the process that I have. And I wish a lot more planners and advisors would use a process like this. But I batch my time. I focus on very specific things at specific times during specific intervals. So I approach the client meeting the same way, right? When we're doing review sessions, I generally recommend we either do 2 or we do 4 a year. We're doing 2, we're going to do this in meeting A and this in meeting B. If we do 4, then we're going to do this in meeting A, this in meeting B.
So it's bite-sized chunks.
Yes, we're going to take parts of it, right? And that way we're still getting everything done. It's updated on an annual basis, but we've had more time to really look a little deeper into each and every one of those components and pieces of the plan. And really that just kind of gets back to life happens, and so you've got to stay on top of it.
Right.
And the last thing I want for anyone, whether they're a client or not, is all of a sudden to wake up and realize, oh, I'm retiring tomorrow, and I have this big giant bucket of money. What do I do with it?
Right.
Well,
or I'm retiring tomorrow and I don't have a big giant bucket of money.
And that's even worse. Yeah.
Well, and and as you said, things happen. I mean, every day we see where there is some tragedy, and in order to even pay final expenses, they're having to do GoFundMe campaigns and things like that, because they never stop to think, hey, something could happen to me.
Yeah. And some of that stuff is things are tragic, and accidents happen. And, but at the same time, I look at those when I get those, and I hate that I feel this way, but there's a part of me that just says, this could have been avoided, one 30-minute meeting that could have been avoided.
And as we've said, it is, especially if you start out young and early, and then it is done, and you're just kind of adding to it as it goes. But that's kind of bringing me to some of the questions that I was thinking as, we were getting ready to talk about this. One of the things that people, are always saying is, and I'm, guessing you hear this enough, Dan, I don't make enough to invest.
Oh, yeah.
That's probably one of the biggest questions that you get. So what do you tell somebody who's, and it doesn't matter if they're 20 or if they're 50, what do you say to somebody who says, I just don't make enough to even invest?
You're wrong. That's what I say. You're wrong.
Right.
It doesn't matter where you are on the income scale. If you're homeless and you make nothing, or you're a mega millionaire and you spend every day on the beach. Nobody can outgrow me, because I have a platform that allows me to work with anybody regardless of their financial position. Now, if you're towards the bottom of that financial scale, obviously the focus immediately, right? The immediate need is we need to educate you on budgeting,
right,
and proper management of your finances, right? So we need to take a deep dive into why is it that you don't feel like. Are
you going to Starbucks every single day?
Yeah. I met with someone not too long ago, and their burn rate, we call it burn rate, right? Their burn rate was over 150% of their income.
And they didn't understand.
Yeah, they didn't understand why their portfolio wasn't showing signs of growth or advancing. Said, your burn rate is over 150% of what you're making. And, I don't care how you look at it. 1 + 1 is 2.
Right.
And 1 - 3 is always -2. And is that right?
Yeah.
Financial planner.
Yeah, 1 - 3. See, Nancy, I have 10 fingers, and if it takes more than that, I get very confused.
I'm Ricky Bobby. I don't know what to do with my hands. The reality is, most people, when they find themselves in that position, either A, they have there's head junk, there's head baggage, that makes them perceive that they don't have enough money to save and invest, or B, they've never been educated, or C, they're in debt, or D, some sort of combination of all the above. And the reality is, look, when my wife and I were younger, this is probably about 13, 14 years ago, we had a considerable amount of debt because of college and a couple of other things, but we worked our way out of it, and we worked our way out of it in under 12 months. But we did that because I sat down with her and her with me, and we said, okay, what's important to you over the next 12 months for this to work for you? And what's important to me over the next 12 months for this to work for me? So we set those priorities aside immediately and knew what they were. Those were the non-negotiables. Those were the do not touch zones, right? So everything else at that point was negotiable, and we put a plan in place and just worked. And 11 months later, 100% of that debt was gone.
Wow.
And so that's what, when I say we've made some really smart financial decisions, it's the same kind of decisions that I want to help clients make. And if they're on that lower end of the income spectrum and they're not, but they feel like they are, they feel like they don't have enough to save or invest, my job at that point is to become a teacher and sit down with them and work through the numbers. Because at the end of the day, it's just math. It's just math. And sometimes I have to be the bearer of good news. Sometimes I have to be the bearer of bad news. And sometimes that bad news is, you're living beyond your means, or
you have got to stop going to Starbucks every day.
Your budget's really out of whack. You're driving a $100,000 vehicle and you make $40,000 a year. Tell me what you're thinking. Why are you driving? And that's actually a real conversation that I've had with someone.
And they might have a very valid reason for that.
Yep. That particular individual, that's a real conversation. They were just getting started in real estate. And so they wanted to present a very polished, luxurious professional image. And I said, okay, I get it, but why don't we sell that back and let's get you a $50,000, $60,000 car, right? That's still luxurious and still nice. And clients are still going to look at you and find you a respectable, reputable professional based on what you drive, because you're in the real estate agent, that's one of the realities is you got to drive a nice car, right? Yeah. So it took some convincing, right? Because sometimes we get emotionally attached to things, especially cars. And I'm a car guy, so I know that really well.
Well, and they were probably looking at other people who had the fancy cars.
But those people also had been in business 10, 15 years.
Yeah.
And
there's ways around, like there's leasing. I mean, like I know somebody who has the expensive cars, but they lease them. Yeah. And they said, it's all, and they said, I bet you my lease payment is less than your car payment. And danged if it wasn't. And they were driving the fancy car and those various things. And, other things like, I've told women, you can go to consignment stores and buy very nice designer label clothes. It sounds like a commercial here at not the designer prices, but the funny thing is a lot of times, and this is, going off the deep end on this one, many times people don't even notice, that's not what they're looking at. It comes back to, are you doing the job for them? Now, granted, if somebody pulls up in a car that I'm really not sure they're going to get me to the house that I want to look at, but as long as I get in the car and it's clean, all these, that's pretty much all I care about. Now, that said, if I were buying $1 million house, I'd probably have a different philosophy. Yeah.
Well, you touched on something there that kind of made me chuckle a little bit. I'm not Dave Ramsey. I'm not going to look at any of my clients and say, I want you to go buy a clunker. I get where Dave Ramsey's coming from, but at the end of the day, we have to recognize he and many of the other infotainment folks out there, that's what they are. They're infotainment. And, it may or may not be good advice. And the thing that always bothers me about the infotainment shows out there is it's a one formula approach to everybody. Well, that's not how financial planning works. It's a case by case design. And, there's no two households alike. And, one couple is going to make $350,000 a year and another couple is going to make $140,000 a year. because they chose professions that just happen to
Mhm.
have different income
Right.
levels. And then you start to talk about kids and lifestyle and where they like to vacation and what food they like. You know, honestly, if you're a big health nut and you eat nothing but healthy food and organic food, your
That's more
grocery,
expensive.
your grocery bill's a little higher,
Mhm.
right? If you eat a bunch of junk food, sorry, I'm a
Yeah.
chocoholic, you know,
But your healthcare costs might be more.
but, I'm trying to be better. Those of you that are health conscious people, I'm trying.
Mhm.
Uh, but you know, so to get to that point though, you need to make practical, smart decisions. And
Mhm.
car buying is one of them. Home buying is one of them. Where you put your assets.
Mhm.
Even one of the things that I talk about a lot, and that I love about Capstone is we, as a firm, they very much are passionate about educating their clients on this one. And that is, you hear a lot about asset allocation.
Mhm.
Don't hear a lot about asset location.
Ah.
And it's important because, you know, in qualified accounts, you can have certain, I'm trying to think through compliance here, make sure I
I know
don't.
you can't give specifics. That's the
Yeah,
tricky
I can't
part.
give specifics,
We
but you
love
can
our
buy
compliance
certain,
people.
you can buy certain things even in a qualified account, right? Like you could buy Apple or McDonald's or whatever
Mhm.
as individual stocks
Mhm.
in a qualified account, but you may or may not want to do that because qualified accounts are treated differently than tax deferred accounts. And there's real tax implications for those decisions. And so, you know, sometimes we really need to have a conversation about asset
Mhm.
location
Right.
more so than asset allocation.
Mhm.
And I also have learned that a lot of people don't even know what asset allocation is, let alone asset
Mhm.
location. So
Right.
again, kind of going back to the educator's heart, I do a lot of educating,
Mhm.
and that's really at the end of the day, that's my job,
Mhm.
right? And it's a lot of therapy, it's a lot of education, a little bit of hand holding, but not
Mhm.
much. And I tell my clients the same thing, every single one of them. End of the day, your financial plan is your financial plan, not mine. So
Right.
I'm going to give you, and my team is going to give you as many options as we can based on the inputs that you give us and the goals that you have and where you want to go.
Mhm.
But it's your plan.
Mhm. Right.
And our job is to educate you to help you put that plan together and
Mhm.
give you the options. And then when you choose the options you want, we're here to help you execute it and review it and track it and measure it and keep it running. But
Right.
you know,
It's still,
and
yeah, it's your personal
requires
choices. Yeah.
that requires,
Mhm.
you know, back and forth,
Mhm.
right? It requires
Mhm.
relationship, just like
Right.
we're doing today. There's
Mhm.
face-to-face conversation that needs to be had. And
Mhm.
it frustrates me sometimes to hear people talk about, oh, I've got a guy, whatever. I'm like, well, who are you with? I'm with, I don't want to pick on anybody in particular.
Yeah, a big name.
You know, I'm with a big name. And I'm like,
Mhm.
well, when's the last time you talked to your guys? Well, I have to call an 800 number.
Yeah, I don't have a guy.
You don't have a guy, you have an 800 number.
Mhm.
You know, and so, and if you've got an 800 number, the reality is you're not sitting down with someone
No.
at least once or twice
Mhm.
a year. So
Mhm.
that's a big deal. And you know, the other thing I'll say, one final thing that I definitely wanted to touch on today is um, there's a big misnomer out there when it comes to retirement planning. So this is probably other than umbrella insurance and estate planning, this is probably the other piece of the top three for me that I try to educate clients on. And that is, there's an area where as an industry, we're very broken. And that is, you know, we're teaching society that retirement planning is all about accumulation,
Mhm.
right? Accumulate assets,
Right.
accumulate wealth, you know, just
If I have a
bigger
whole
is
bunch when I
better,
retire, I'll be okay.
more,
Mhm.
right? But the reality is, how many, can you just imagine, just close your eyes and imagine that you've been on this magical hike through this beautiful forest, lots of nature and scenery and flowers and wildlife, and it's just absolute roses, right? And then all of a sudden you come to the end of the trail. At the end of the trail is a giant waterfall,
Mhm.
right? I equate that waterfall to retirement. And
Mm.
now all of a sudden you're at that waterfall and retirement says it's time for you to jump over the cliff.
Mhm.
It's a big cliff.
Right, and you're going, no,
It's a
I
very
can't swim.
right? So how are you going to get down to the bottom
Mhm.
where the bottom of the waterfall and that lake is that the waterfall is spilling into
Mhm.
so that you can swim around in that little lagoon and enjoy life until you die?
Right.
How are you going to get there?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a parachute? Is there a way to get down there? And that's probably a terrible metaphor, but end of the day, everybody always talks about accumulation.
Mm-hmm.
Well, nobody's talking about distribution.
Mm-hmm.
Really, if you're really focused on retirement planning, you should be having the conversation with your planner or your advisor about, hey, what kind of income can I expect
Mm-hmm.
in retirement? And 30 plus years ago, there's some brilliant minds that created a couple of illustrations. One's called the Monte Carlo simulation, and they were great. And the Monte Carlo simulation said you need to draw 3 to 4% of your assets
Mm-hmm.
every year to not draw down your assets too much in retirement. Well,
Right.
there's a couple of problems with that now, right? That was 30 plus years ago.
Mm-hmm.
We're living a lot longer now, so
Right.
longevity is a problem.
Yeah. And you're
So
in
that 3 to
retirement a lot longer.
Absolutely. We're living longer, so that 3 to 4%
Mm-hmm.
that the Monte Carlo simulation and others like it recommend is now more like 2 to 3%.
Mm-hmm.
And oh, by the way, it was kind of expected that a lot of those assets were left in the market.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is where sequence of returns becomes a very, very big deal.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine if you retired at the end of last year, fourth quarter last year,
Mm-hmm.
right? So fourth quarter 2018, what did the market do?
It hit a rough spot.
It hit a little rough spot. And some people think that was the big one
Mm-hmm.
for this cycle, and some people think it was a trimmer.
Mm-hmm.
I won't speculate because I can't, but
Those compliance people won't let you do that.
well, their job is to keep us safe and to keep clients safe. I get that.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that it was the big one.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there is a correction looming. And at the end of the day, if all of a sudden you're retiring in a down year,
Right.
well, all your assets just took a big hit right at the time you're supposed to start drawing.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a good play.
No,
It's
no.
not. And
You drained a lot of water out of that pool before you ever even started to swim.
right. And if it's another 2008,
Mm-hmm.
well, all of a sudden your $1 million portfolio just became a $600,000 portfolio.
Right.
Whoops.
Mm-hmm.
So there needs to be, in my opinion, a much different conversation about retirement planning.
Mm-hmm.
That conversation needs to start with, all right, let's plan for income. How are we going to create a distribution strategy that makes sense, that locks in a certain amount of income? What kind of income do you want in retirement? What kind of lifestyle do you want in retirement?
Right.
Really, that is a conceptual conversation that has to begin with when you retire. If you close your eyes and you pretend that tomorrow is retirement, what does it look like? Where are you at? Who are you with? What are you doing?
Mm-hmm.
And why?
Right.
We all have that fantasy in our mind of what that looks like.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
But, we need to know as financial planners and advisors what our client's
Mm-hmm.
dream is and what it looks like,
Right.
so that we can then evaluate, okay, is that within reason
Mm-hmm.
based on the numbers we have today or
Mhm.
not?
Yeah.
And if it's not, is there a way to bridge that gap or not? And if not, then what? Do we make
Right.
adjustments on the other?
Yeah. You might
There's a
not
lot
be
that
able
goes
to
into
buy
that.
that island, but you might be able to have some beachfront property.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Exactly. So it's just having that conversation, and it's an ongoing conversation.
Mhm.
But there's definitely other strategies beyond accumulation that need to be discussed between planners and clients.
Mhm.
And I think income distribution, particularly when it comes to retirement,
Mhm.
is one of them. I also think that sequence of returns.
Mhm.
I would encourage anybody and everybody out there, if they're listening to the show, Google sequence of returns. There's a company out there called BlackRock that produced a very wonderful illustration called sequence of returns. And it talks about markets go up and markets go down. And when you retire, the market can have a tremendous impact for the better or for the worse on your assets if you don't have a two-pronged approach. And it's really what's called two economic powers, right? There's rate of return, sequence of return, but there's also actuarial science. And that's the conversation that's not being had, is the actuarial science conversation. I happen to be kind of well-versed in that area, especially with my PNC background, because it's all actuarial driven. And, and then just kind of tie it all together. I think that you need to have a little bit of both, but where each and every individual puts those percentages, how much they allocate to one or the other, it's going to vary from person to person, but we've got to have that conversation.
Right. Well, good golly, Dan, this really has been fascinating. And, it's one of those things that we want to encourage people to have those discussions. If you haven't had those discussions, you need to start those discussions, whether it's you, whether you're part of a couple, part of a family, all those various things. Reach out, find those trusted advisors. If they want to contact you, Dan, how do they contact you?
Easiest way is by phone. You can either call or text this number, but my number is 404-384-7756. My email address, I think you have that, but I'll share that too. It's D, my first initial, Dan, D, and my last name, B-O-L-E-S, B as in boy, O-L-E-S. So dboles at capstonefn.com. And then I think you'll put that in the description and everything too. But you can also just Google me and you can find me that way. You can go to capstonefinancialga.com, or you can go to danboles.com. One way or another, that'll get you to me.
Perfect.
But I'm pretty accessible. I'm pretty easy to find.
Great. Well, and as you said, if it's not something you can help with, you can get them somewhere else, because clearly, we have a lot of people who probably aren't in Georgia, all those various things. But, we need to, folks, that's not an excuse. We can't say, well, I didn't know who to talk to. No, in this day and age, that is definitely not an excuse. So, Dan, I certainly look forward to the next time that we talk, because it's a great conversation. And it's funny, it's not business, but it is business, because if our financial houses aren't in order, then our business house can't be in order. And so it all ties together. And of course, then there is that whole thing with, planning for your business future and all of those various things. And it just gets so confusing. So, we will definitely have you on again. I look forward to the next time. But I am Deb Creer. I've been having a great time talking with Dan Boles. And until next time, everyone have a great day.
Thanks for listening to the Business Power Hour, hosted by Deb Creer. Join us next time for more real-life stories and techniques to power up your business.
You've been listening to C-Suite Radio. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.